Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now, before we speak of forks, those curious little tools of culinary ambition, we must first drift through ancient halls where fingers were the undisputed champions of supper. Yes, dear listener, once upon a time, nobody poked their peas with cold-tined elegance. They pinched and scooped with enthusiasm, and no one batted an eyelid, unless their stew was too hot, in which case several eyes were singed, and brows were permanently suspicious. Let's time slip to around the 4th century BCE, ancient Greece. Picture this: a handsome marble courtyard smelling faintly of olives and ambition. Our noble Athenian friend, Demetrios, is at rehearsal for what's either a dramatic production or a very heated town meeting. Honestly, it's hard to tell. Regardless, when it comes time for lunch, Demetrios is handed a hunk of bread, some figs, and a chunk of roasted lamb. No fork, not even a spoon, just hands and hubris. The Greeks didn't need fancy implements. Their bread doubled as a ladle, napkin, and cutlery, all rolled delightfully into one loafy unit. It was both sustenance and sponge, culinary multitasking at its finest. Even Socrates, widely considered the smart one at the table, never demanded extra utensils. He simply wiped his philosophical fingers on his tunic and got back to debating whether anyone actually knew anything at all. Meanwhile, over in ancient Rome, things took a turn for the flamboyant. Banquets there weren't just meals. They were edible opera, often lasting for hours and including courses that should have come with a zoologist and several warning labels. Still, when it came time to eat, Romans mostly used their fingers too. They had knives. At least one nobleman had a dagger so beautiful it had its own poems. But forks? No, those were for cooking and maybe smiting potatoes that looked suspiciously rebellious. They did have a tool called a ligula, a small spoon for sauces, and whatever jellied something was taking the table hostage. But the fork, as we know it, sat somewhere off stage, patiently waiting its cue. Fast forward to around the 7th century. Dusty roads through Byzantium, now Constantinople, now Istanbul, now back to being a place with excellent baklava, carried trade, stories, and glittering goods. And among these treasures was something truly revolutionary, a small, two-pronged eating instrument made of gold and sass. Yes, this was the fork's first flirtation with fame, shepherded in not by a knight or a king, but by a woman. Her name was Theodora Anna Doukaina, a Byzantine princess, sharp of wit and sharper of cheekbones. She married into Venice. Imagine silk, spice, and scandal crossing over choppy, gondola-strewn waters. At a lavish feast, she dared to use her delicate gold fork to daintily spear a morsel of melon. Gasps, whispers. The clergy clutched their rosaries like she'd tried to baptize a chicken. Using a fork, it was said, was an offense to God's perfectly good fingers. Modern scholars suspect jealousy, theatrical flair, and a deep fear of cutlery-induced elegance. Regardless, poor Theodora was scorned, and after her untimely death, some whispered she had been smote for her sins of sophistication. The lesson: in every century, there's someone who thinks you changing the rules is a sign of the apocalypse, or at least a sign dinner's gotten too posh. But the fork, dear listener, did not vanish. It paused. It bided its time, lurking in drawers, admired in secret, whispering to curious noblemen, "Do you really want gravy on your doublet again?" And so we rest here, hovering on the cusp of change, in a world still ruled by fingers, bread spoons, and a quietly rising tide of pointy innovation. The fork is coming, slowly, elegantly, like a cat approaching your lap. Only if that cat were made of polished silver and vaguely threatening angles. Now, as the candle flickers lower and Brother Oswin finally finds the scriptorium cat asleep on the vellum pile again, perhaps you'll remember how odd and brave it once was to poke one's food with prongs. Forks were once feared, ridiculed, and scandalous, and somehow still fancier than your cousin's Instagram brunch. If you're still awake, press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Long before salad forks rustled through crisp romaine, or dessert forks met their dramatic destiny in a lava cake, humanity was rather pointedly under-equipped. Food, you see, wasn't gently coaxed into the mouth. It was speared, slurped, pinched, or, if etiquette had stepped out for a breather, simply grabbed. There was no twinkle of silverware across candlelit tables, only fingers, knives, and occasionally sticks that pretended to know what they were doing. Somewhere around 2000 BC, the people living in what is now Iran began using what we might tentatively call forks. But let's not get carried away with visions of dainty, gleaming cutlery. These early forks were two-pronged and decidedly businesslike, used not for eating, bless them, but for cooking or serving, much like that giant, vaguely threatening fork that your uncle still uses to barbecue steaks. Not exactly the sort of instrument you'd want hovered near your bouche. The ancient Egyptians had their own elegant system, fingers mostly, sometimes spoons. Spoons which, by the way, are the beaming overachievers of the utensil world, with roots that dig deep into the Neolithic age. Spoons got invited everywhere. Knives too, sharp as ever, slicing and spreading their way through history. But the fork was like the socially awkward cousin who lingered near the punch bowl of civilization, hoping one day to be noticed. And then, in the shadowy corridors of history, cue dramatic yet sleepy violin music, the Byzantines stepped in. Constantinople, jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, was not only a bustling center for trade and theology, but also, quite unexpectedly, the site of an early fork awakening. In the 7th century, refined Byzantine dining customs favored not savage gnawing, but delicately lifting food with small, pronged utensils. Real forks, miniature tridents of table decorum. Now, lest this sound too refined, remember that using a fork back then, at least to those looking in from the outside, was suspiciously hoity-toity behavior. Forks were associated with wealth, possibly witchcraft, or at least unacceptable fondness for cleanliness. The church, which had many thoughts and no fork drawers, found the idea a little too flamboyant. There's a famous moment from the Venetian court in the 11th century, when a Byzantine princess named Theodora Dukaina, who'd married into the Italian elite, dared to bring her very own gold fork to dinner. Imagine the scandal. She did not use her hands. She pierced her food like a tiny defiant goddess. Fork over fingers, blasphemy, or worse, delicacy. According to one aghast contemporary monk, such finickiness could only mean moral decay, and soon led to divine punishment, namely, illness and death. It seems hygiene was still a harder sell than fire and brimstone. And yet, like many things thought silly or sinful at first, like bathing too often or listening to podcasts, forks persevered. They gleamed quietly in the courts of the East, were adopted with caution in Italy, and still earned polite side-eye in Northern Europe, where folks believed knives and hands made perfectly trustworthy meal companions. But slowly, like a methodical tortoise at a particularly formal salad bar, the fork crept westward, It charmed with its practicality. It twinkled with a vague sense of sophistication. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Italian nobility had begun to include forks at feasts, at first only for foods that were slippery, gooey, or otherwise socially hazardous. Long, saucy pasta would tangle up honour and napkins indiscriminately if approached finger first. A fork extended a gentleman's dignity by approximately several inches, and conveniently kept one's embroidered cuffs out of the marinara. If Rome wasn't built in a day, fork acceptance wasn't either. It would be several more centuries before those humble prongs earned a full invitation to the European dinner table. But in this slow, improbable migration of metal toothpicks from suspicion to necessity, something quietly momentous was happening. The dinner fork, once feared, once mocked, once clutched only by monks issuing warnings, was forging its destiny, which leads us to a most unlikely hero in this tale of culinary evolution. A French court that took etiquette so seriously, they built palaces for it. As the silver shines into the next chapter, let's gently drift toward a world of powdered wigs, buttered asparagus, and nobles who finally began to view the fork as more than a flamboyant novelty, but as a necessary instrument of status and soup acquisition. The sun had only just considered rising over ancient Egypt, casting lazy golds and treacly ambers across the Nile's glossy surface, when the question no one asked floated quietly in the warm air. What did Egyptians eat? And how the pharaoh did they eat it? Utensils, after all, weren't the first thing early civilizations bothered to invent. Fire, sure. Temples, absolutely. Elaborate eyeliner with the precision of a Parisian makeup artist. Naturally. But forks, not yet. This was a hand-eating world, and Egypt was no exception. Bread was the cutlery of the day. A scoop, a spoon, and sometimes, regrettably, an entire napkin all in one. Now imagine this. You are an ancient Egyptian noble, reclining in graceful discomfort on a linen-tufted lounge. Before you is a platter holding freshly roasted duck glazed with date honey, lentils sautéed with garlic, and pyramid-shaped piles of barley bread. It smells divine. But there's a problem. That duck is slicker than the politics at the court of Ramses II. And though your fingers are skilled in the art of eyeliner application and sacred scroll turning, they are failing miserably at retrieving the meat without also retrieving oil all over your favorite kilt. This, dear listener, was the beginning of a problem humanity didn't know it was having. Meals of increasing complexity requiring tools of increasing specificity. The traditional Egyptian approach was tactile. Food was a sensation of the hand as much as the palate. But sticky meat and broth-heavy stews made things complicated. People experimented. Sharp knives carved, yes, but occasionally stabbed an unsuspecting lentil. Wooden spoons scraped bowls and, in the hands of overeager children, made weapon-like clangs. Yet the pronged invention we now call the fork had yet to appear on Egypt's golden horizon. Interestingly, while the Egyptians didn't invent the fork, they did dabble in proto-forkery. Archaeologists have uncovered two-pronged serving utensils buried with tomb goods. Elegant, loop-handled brass tools perhaps used for fish or turning meat, never for eating directly. These were serving forks, not the kind you'd bring to your lips during a rooftop soiree beneath the Cairo sky. They weren't for eating like a pharaoh, more for assisting other people to eat like one. Their absence at the ancient buffet table can partly be blamed on cultural taboos. Eating with tools was considered suspiciously unhuman, impersonal even. There's something sanguine about the touch of food. Fingers tracing the texture of boiled chickpeas, or testing the resilience of grilled catfish before it disappears into one's mouth. using a fork might have felt like an uncomfortable mix of dining and weaponry, which Egyptians had carefully quarantined into two separate categories. Unless you were Cleopatra, who, legend suggests, could weaponize charm and figs in equal measure. Still, the fork, or at least the concept of puncturing and lifting food with metal, was lurking somewhere in the metaphorical sands of time, too shy perhaps to arrive at the world's first great civilization, but certainly planting seeds. So they continued as they were. Dignified banquet tables with footstools for elegance and bowls of scented water for post-meal freshening. People laughed, gossiped, told stories of gods and floods, and whether someone had offended Ra by double-dipping bread chunks in the communal sauce bowl. Utensils remained mostly ornamental or ceremonial. Eating, though devout and decadent, was unabashedly manual. And then, as always, Egypt passed the torch, or should we say, the bread, onto other civilizations: Greece, Rome, Byzantium, places that would soon take up the fork's cause with varying degrees of enthusiasm and scandal, as we shall see. But before our tale prongs forward across the Mediterranean, let us linger a few moments more with the elegant, if slightly greasy, hands of Egyptian diners. Let us imagine the glowing lanterns swaying along the palace breeze, illuminating pyramid silhouettes and lotus-shaped bowls, the smell of coriander and cumin, duck fat and date wine filling the velvet dusk. The fork, not yet at the feast, but food, always, always in hand. And soon, in other hands, in other lands, where the fork would finally find its footing, or at least a place at the table. Ah, Italy, land of opera, olive oil, and overt hand gestures. And, perhaps less obviously celebrated, the birthplace of our modern dinner fork's resurgence, though not without stirring the moral panic of the millennium. Let's drift back to the 11th century, to a city of golden domes and particularly judgy priests, Venice. At this point in European dietary history, the fork was still viewed with roughly as much suspicion as flatbread at a croissant convention. Most folks were perfectly content using knives, spoons, and of course, the veteran digits, fingers. Food was pokeable, tearable, scoopable. Why fix what wasn't violently impaling anyone? Enter Theodora Anna Ducana, a Byzantine princess with a name as long and grand as her entrance. She arrived in Venice around the year 1005 to marry the Doge's son, bringing with her an entourage of silk, spices, and scandalous table manners. At her wedding feast, she did something so shocking, so unnatural, the devout nearly spilled their wine. She ate with a tiny golden fork. Silence fell. The monk chronicler St. Peter Damian, who apparently had nothing better to do, recorded her behavior with the horror one might reserve for goats reciting Latin spells. Her delicacy, he huffed, exceeded human decency, and muttered something about how God had already given humans natural forks, fingers, as if that argument had ever worked. The fork, at that time, was not looked upon kindly by many in the West. It was associated with Eastern decadence, pride, and worst of all, hygiene. To pick up food with prongs instead of your own blessed hands was seen as theatrical at best, diabolical at worst. Imagine using a tiny trident to jab your dates and figs. People seriously thought this was a slippery slope to trident waving down in the fiery depths. Poor Theodora. She didn't live long to enjoy her forked rebellion, succumbing, as history likes to note smugly, to illness a few years after her wedding. Naturally, some took this as divine punishment for her fork-wielding ways. Other people died of the plague, spoiled meat, and ill-tempered donkeys. But Theodora, definitely the fork. Still, like all outlawed trends, the fork began its slow, glinting infiltration into polite society. You couldn't keep in-laws nor outlaws from eventually copying the shiny new things. By the 14th century, Italy had quietly adopted the fork for eating sticky foods, mainly pasta, because nothing wrecks a silk tunic faster than an airborne strand of spaghetti. A fork provided neatness, elegance, and considerably fewer tomato-related casualties. Venetians, always the stylish showboats, had started crafting forks with two slender tines, like miniature pitchforks for food, useful for twirling noodles and spearing slices of roasted pheasant while gossiping about the Pope's latest hat. Those of nobler classes began showing off their forks in elaborate feasts, often made of silver or gold. Not necessarily for utility, mind you, but because nothing says "I'm better than you" like jabbing your duck confit with a piece of precious metal. And we mustn't forget the growing etiquette books of Renaissance Italy. These were the YouTube tutorials of their day. If YouTube videos were written in Latin and deeply concerned with what angle to daintily lift your tines. And yet, outside of Italy, the rest of Europe was still dragging its medieval heels. Forks remained suspicious, vaguely foreign, and possibly sorcerous. France, always ambivalent between culinary curiosity and culinary ego, sniffed at Italian affectations. Germany didn't trust a tool that couldn't also slice something. And England? Well, England preferred puddings, and spoons tended to dominate that realm. But change, as always, simmers before it boils. And it was in the flickering candlelight of Italian courts and the gentle clatter of banquets that the fork began to establish itself, not just as a curiosity, but a quiet revolution in how humans handled their food. Let your mind rest now in the rococo shadows of a Venetian dining hall, candle flames shivering beside silver goblets and golden bread baskets. Picture satin sleeves brushing the edge of cherrywood tables and the occasional delicate clink of tines meeting porcelain. Tomorrow, we'll follow that shimmering trail northward toward a certain empire of powdered wigs and passionate opinions on asparagus. Somewhere between the fall of the Roman Empire and your grandmother's 12-piece silverware set sits a curious moment in time, when European dinner guests first encountered a peculiar little instrument, the fork. Not in the sense that your local cafe gives you one wrapped in a napkin next to a stale roll, but a stranger, more suspicious idea of it. One with just two tines, like tiny devil's horns, poking politely at a concept known as table manners. By the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire, still clinging to its glittery mosaics and very passionate theological debates, had a more advanced view of utensil life. They were no strangers to fancy eating rituals, and it was here that our hero enters. Theodora Dukaina, a Byzantine princess marrying into the Venetian court, as one does when one is royalty and one's dowry includes gold, silks, and shockingly foreign cutlery. Imagine the Venetian nobility gathered in layers of brocade and body odor, doing their best to look civil while firmly gripping chunks of roasted meat with their hands. Suddenly, Theodora pulls out a gleaming fork, two golden prongs arching like the tusks of a fashionable beetle, dips it daintily into a fig, and lifts it to her lips without so much as a drip. The silence was thicker than risotto. Now, you or I might applaud Theodora's commitment to cleanliness, but her regal utensil was not viewed as admirable. No, it was called unholy. The local clergy, always with more opinions than forks, swiftly condemned the device. They claimed it was indulgent, even blasphemous. After all, God had given us fingers, hadn't he? If a woman insisted on using a golden claw to eat figs, Obviously, she was disrespecting divine design and probably selling her soul to the devil between spoonfuls. One particularly passionate priest compared it to artificial prosthetic limbs for food. A disturbingly modern complaint, really, and a striking overreaction to cutlery. Venice wasn't ready. Theodora died not long after, tragically, though possibly of unrelated causes, and so the fork slinked back into Eastern obscurity, not yet ready for a starring role. But wait, don't poke your peas just yet. The fork, unlike poorly made pillow stuffing, had resilience. It took another few centuries for it to sneak back westward, and when it did, it wasn't thanks to royalty as much as it was the rise of Renaissance hygiene. Over time, diners began to realize that eating stew with one's greasy hands lacked a certain romance. Also, it left stains on those fluffy white ruffs around their necks. Ruffs which were increasingly difficult to get cleaned unless you had a servant and a small river. Enter the fork, by now sporting 3 or even 4 tines, all the better for spaghetti, which had stormed the Italian peninsula like a wheat-based tsunami. By the 16th century, the fork had become vaguely fashionable in Italy among the upwardly mobile, as in upwardly stabbing their gnocchi. And when Italian etiquette books started praising fork usage as dignified and evolved, the rest of ornate spoon-hugging Europe started to take notes. Still, there was resistance. France, for instance, held out longer than a toddler refusing broccoli. It wasn't until Catherine de' Medici, another food-forward Italian, married into the French crown and brought her forks with her that Parisian tables started to give in. Even then, the French fork affair was awkward and tentative. Kind of like your first school dance. Too much perfume, too many sharp edges, a lot of people fumbling. Forks didn't take root so much as sneak in, like a clever guest at a wedding pretending they're on the list. And then, England, oh England, forever cautious, perpetually miffed by anything continental. Even well into the 17th century, English gentlemen prided themselves on carving meat with knives as long as their resumes and scooping with fingers that proudly bore the grease of history. The fork, to them, was suspicious, exotic, and, God forbid, effeminate. That is, until one curious and rather dandyish man named Thomas Coriat travelled to Italy, noticed the locals weren't rubbing olive oil on their gowns at supper, and decided that perhaps clean eating was not, in fact, heretical. He brought forks back to England in the 1600s and was mocked mercilessly for using them. People called them Coriat's crutches, which sounds supportive but was anything but. Still, the seed was planted, and by the time the 1700s moseyed in, with their powdered wigs, polished pianos, and tendency toward lobster thermidor, the fork was finally established, quietly, stubbornly, as if it had always been there. But before it became a banquet hall staple, and confused children decided whether to use the salad fork or dinner fork, something remarkable happened on the high seas. Centuries before the clicking of cutlery echoed across dining rooms, before the napkin had taken its solemn oath to die protecting your shirt, there was Venice. Not the crowded, selfie stick-filled Venice of today, but a fragrant, flickering Venice of the 11th century, where gondolas glided, lanterns swung gently in salty air, and spice merchants whispered secrets over barrels of cinnamon and contraband nutmeg. It was here, along one of the winding, watery arteries of La Serenissima, that a Byzantine princess known as Theodora Dukaina came ashore, bringing with her 2 very precious things: a dowry fit for a king, and, far more scandalously, a fork. Now, in the blunt theatre of early medieval Europe, a fork was not what it is today. Not the workaday utensil you might jab into a Tuesday meatloaf. No. This was a strange two-pronged metal spearing device that, up until then, most Venetians assumed was used either for torture or dramatic reenactments of Neptune's wrath during festive parades. The Byzantine court, of course, had already started dabbling in forks. The refined people of Constantinople didn't see the point of using their fingers when finely wrought silver sticks could skewer candied fruits without mussing up one's brocade sleeves. But in pious Western Europe, where food was eaten with grim determination and a side of moral superiority, the idea of a fork seemed nearly heretical. So when Theodora sat at her wedding feast, elegantly plucking morsels of roast meat and honey-soaked pastries with her teeny trident, the clergy nearly choked on their boiled lentils. The Doge, bless his embroidered soul, watched with polite bewilderment, while one particularly theatrical deacon reportedly declared, and I quote, "God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, his fingers. To substitute them with metal is to insult his divine design." It was a serious fork shaming. Still, Theodora remained decorously unbothered, eating her stuffed dates with serene precision, like a woman quite sure of her decisions and quite done with sticky fingers. Did anyone adopt her silver innovation immediately? Absolutely not. It would take centuries for the idea to find its footing, or footing for its prongs if you like puns with a side of roast duck. But what Theodora did was plant a seed, a glimmer of gleaming practicality that lingered in Venetian minds as quiet admiration, or possibly mild jealousy. Because let's be honest, forks were just too elegant to stay ostracized forever. You could stab things with accuracy, twirl noodles like a culinary sorcerer. No more flinging hot strands of durum wheat across the table like edible jump ropes. And still, the fork had to bide its time, lofting about palaces and noble courts like a glamorous guest no one dared ask to leave, but no one quite invited to dinner either. In truth, the fork's social rehabilitation was not a story of practicality, but of posture. It would take high-fashion, French-speaking aristocrats, never ones to waste an opportunity to look smug, to elevate it from Eastern curiosity to full-blown trend. But that's a tale for another moonlit moment. Tonight, let's linger in Venice a little longer. Picture torch-lit banquets beside canals, the perfume of rosemary and roasted figs wafting through the air, a slow mandolin playing from somewhere too perfect to question. Theodora, adorned in imperial silks and Byzantine pearls, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a napkin sewn from rumours and minor miracles. And somewhere, at the back of some long caterer's storeroom, a humble cook ponders the pointed utensil she left behind. He holds it up against the light of a flaming candelabrum, tests it against a tender olive, and perhaps he thinks, not with blasphemy, but with curiosity, that maybe poking your food isn't the worst idea after all. Gently, let your thoughts drift with the gondolas, their curved backs rising and dipping like contented sighs. For the fork has begun its slow, glimmering journey westward, and very soon it will find itself in royal hands again, this time in gilded halls where powdered wigs and pastry towers reign supreme. Somewhere in the sweeping haze of the late 9th century, nestled within the candle-flickering chambers of Constantinople, a noblewoman named Theophano was preparing for a banquet, the kind of affair where peacocks were stuffed with smaller birds, wine flowed like gossip from the court eunuchs, and the silverware sparkled with centuries of accumulated imperial insecurity. But unlike the usual feasts of Byzantium, this one featured something pokey. You see, Theophano didn't want to smear goose fat across her cheek, like some goat-herding peasant clawing at a drumstick. She wanted finesse, elegance. She wanted to pick at her roast delicacies with a refined tool plucked from the gods themselves, or, more realistically, from Baghdad, where trade caravans just happened to be hawking fancy, pointy things. So she lifted the two-pronged utensil to her lips, delicately skewered a honey-glossed fig, and set off a ripple through the high society of the Eastern Roman Empire that would, in time, reach your grandma's cutlery drawer. Now, technically, versions of the fork had already been skittering around the ancient world for a while. Egyptians had used bronze pokers. The Persians had metal prongs for centuries, but these weren't dinner forks. They were perhaps more barbecue adjacent. Theophano, however, was wielding her fork deliberately, like a fashion statement, and the Byzantines, lovers of all things gold, theological, and vaguely impractical, began to take notice. Still, forks didn't exactly have an easy PR campaign. When Theophano married Otto II and moved west to the Holy Roman Empire, where dinner was more a matter of tearing than of tasting, she brought her fashionable table habits with her, and the German clergy, ever suspicious of objects with devilish protrusions, were aghast. One holy man, in utter horror, declared her fork an abomination. God in his wisdom has provided mankind with natural forks, his fingers. That's right. Mighty theological proclamations were made about the accessory you just used to chase a stray pea across your plate. To be fair, Europe was going through a bit of a utensil identity crisis. Knives were acceptable. They doubled as weapons, so naturally they fit right in. Spoons had a long-standing relationship with soup, but forks were foreign, feminized, and perilously pointy. Far too genteel for the average knight who preferred their food closer to a melee than a meal. And yet, the fork did what all disruptive technologies eventually do. It waited, quietly, patiently, like a well-mannered vampire. It glimmered in the noble courts of Venice, slowly seducing aristocrats one truffle-stuffed mushroom at a time. By the 11th century, Venetians were importing forks from Byzantium and beginning to understand the curious joy of eating ravioli without launching it into your neighbor's lap. It was here, among lace collars, glass goblets, and an increasingly carb-forward diet, that the fork began its slow climb to culinary credibility. Still, old Europe dragged its heels. France tutted. England frowned. The German states wrote stern, forkless dinner invitations. But Venice, oh luscious, lascivious Venice, whispered rumors that forks preserved a lady's complexion, preventing sauces from touching the lips. A fork could keep you beautiful, darling, and who could resist? Over time, this preaching of prettiness outpaced the moral panic. By the Renaissance, forks had tiptoed their way into the dining habits of the elite, with well-dressed Italians spearing artichoke hearts while quoting Ovid. Catherine de' Medici is said to have brought forks to France when she married Henry II in the 16th century. The same Catherine who also brought ballet, haute cuisine, and a generally suspicious attitude toward dull dinners. So while the peasants still dined like saber-toothed wolves, the royals were becoming fluent in utensil ease, knife, spoon, and now fork. The trinity was nearly complete. What's rather endearing, or mildly absurd, is that the small, innocuous fork spent nearly 1,000 years clawing its way across Europe, all to earn a humble seat at your weekday stir-fry. And yet, our journey is still missing something, a twist, perhaps a twirl. Because while the fork had arrived, it had yet to meet its most curvy companion, one that would inspire impassioned pasta duets, seductive spaghetti dances, and the occasional sauce-stained shirt at an unfortunate family dinner. Close your eyes now and prepare to enter the tangled tale of the spoon's round cousin. As stars pricked through the velvet dusk above 16th century Venice, the city was a tangle of lantern glow and gondola whispers. Canals mirrored the moon. Footsteps echoed over stone bridges with a kind of mystery that suggests secrets hidden in opera cloaks and spice satchels. And somewhere, floating lightly across centuries of culinary suspicion, the humble fork was enjoying a slow, cautious rebirth. By now, the fork had already caused a minor moral panic in Constantinople, survived ecclesiastical frowns in Byzantium, and baffled the good people of early France, who thought it an unnecessary inconvenience, like a second nose or a rogue pineapple in a stew. But Venice, Venice was ready. It began, as curiosity so often does with trade. You see, Venice wasn't just a city with canals. It was a shimmering crossroads of worlds. Silks from China, spices from India, and yes, forks from the East, all passed through its dreamily inefficient customs houses. If the Mediterranean was a sea of secrets, Venice was the clever port that translated them into lira and lace. The Venetian elite had an eye for everything lavishly impractical, and when they glimpsed two-pronged golden forks from the East, their thoughts were less tool and more statement piece. While peasants across Europe were still defending their meals bravely with nothing but knives and 10 fingers, Venetian nobility began gingerly stabbing candied fruits and sweetmeats with ornate objects that looked more like jewelry than cutlery. One of the earliest documented Venetian fork fanciers was a woman named Maria Argyropoulina, a Byzantine princess who married a high-ranking Venetian noble in the 11th century. And here's where the tale gets deliciously scandalous. Maria brought along her personal forks, delicate, dainty little pitchforks of gold, and used them during feasts like they were nothing unusual. This did not go unnoticed by onlookers. Gossip began clinking faster than wine cups. How dare she not use her God-given fingers? Some whispered it was haughty. Others were more dramatic, claiming, gasp, that using forks might be an affront to divine design. Even St. Peter didn't need one. And yet, there was something hypnotic about the way Maria wielded her little fork, lifting figs and sugared almonds with a grace that no sticky-fingered baron could rival. The local clergy may have muttered, but fashion has a way of outpacing morality, especially when it comes in gold. Over the next few centuries, forks started to appear more frequently at Venetian banquets, though usually in elite circles where opulence drowned out objections. They remained two-pronged, of course, more akin to tiny tridents than anything modern. Three-pronged forks wouldn't come along until some bright spark decided one more prong meant less chance of dropping a meatball. But for now, 2 prongs were sufficient for showing off. They were less about utility and more about theatre. Imagine a noblewoman slowly lifting a sliver of pear from her porcelain plate, arms slightly extended like a royal heron, or a powdered nobleman dabbing his lips and reaching daintily for a candied chestnut, too proud to sully his lace cuffs with jam. Function was secondary. The fork was a sybaritic sonnet. Of course, this embrace of the fork didn't go unchecked. Some conservative corners still bristled. A few pamphlets fluttered around, questioning the moral integrity of artificial food elevation. But the ripples had begun. Venice, true to type, was shaping a trend simply by being fabulous. And somewhere in a quiet corner of a busy palazzo kitchen, a servant stared at the strange glittering utensil and muttered something like, "You mean I've got to clean that too?" The fork's real triumph in Venice wasn't culinary, it was cultural. It had danced its way onto tables not by appealing to logic, but by seducing the senses. In Venice, forks were flirtatious, frivolous, and often fabulous. And as moonlight spilled lazily over the Grand Canal, embedding silver ribbons into the lapping water below, the fork's future was already reclining on velvet cushions, sipping almond milk, and waiting for its moment to travel again. Next, the tale drifts eastward, where imperial whispers in a certain cold capital would turn this delicate utensil into a symbol of order, elegance, and a very particular kind of royal dinner discipline. By the time forks tiptoed into the high society soirees of Europe, they were still considered exotic, even suspicious, as if carrying not just bite-sized bits of food, but perhaps a whiff of sin. Strange how something with prongs could invite so much moral concern, but then again, humans have always had a flair for assigning deep significance to inanimate tableware. One particularly spicy rumour nibbled at the respectability of forks in the 11th century, involving a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulina. Yes, her name sounds like a limited edition diamond variety, and she herself was presented to the court of Venice like a rare jewel, intended to wed the Doge's son. Not unlike a historical episode of Forks and the City, really. Now, Maria arrived from Constantinople with her silks, her spices, and scandalously, her golden two-pronged forks. In a clink heard round the dinner table, she began using them with the confidence of someone slicing leisure into every bite. To the Venetians, who were still very much in love with their spoons and fingers, it was as if she had pulled out a tiny devil's pitchfork and used it to stab her fruit. People gasped. Church leaders frowned. A bishop is even said to have claimed that using such a luxurious and artificial instrument was an insult to God himself, who had already given humans natural forks, otherwise known as fingers. A theological position that, while deeply reverent, might have been a tad sticky come soup season. As if the silverware drama weren't enough, the princess tragically died not long after. Some whispered it was divine retribution for her audacious utensil use. Others thought Venice's sudden switch to her perfume and embroidery styles might have had a better explanation. Either way, the fork was now tangled in whispers and worry, sort of the Meghan Markle of medieval flatware. Still, as parts of Europe watched the East with a curious eye, there was a slow forkward motion. The clever utensils began to appear more and more among wealthy circles, tucked beside knives as if trying not to draw too much attention. In Italy, the fork started finding friends among the upper crust, likely because someone eventually realized that twirling a steaming heap of spaghetti around a spoon using your fingers was about as effective as catching mist in a bucket. And just like that, forks proved themselves not just tools of elegance, but of undeniable practicality. Nature had given us fingers, yes, but it had not accounted for marinara. And once pasta arrived, brought home by travelers and traders, it wasn't long before the fork earned a place beside the dinner plate without inciting a minor ecclesiastical crisis. Let us not underestimate the impact of pasta in this tale. Lightly boiled, lovingly sauced, and naturally twist-prone, noodles may very well have been the fork's best publicist. In the awkward courtship between food and tool, pasta was the charming intermediary whispering, "Give it a try, you'll never go back." And so, our sly, pointy friend began a slow but delicious infiltration. It crept across tables in Florence, curtsied at courts in Milan, and finally twirled its way into respectability. No longer a sign of decadence or defiance, the fork became a staple of civility, though in some corners it still wore the lingering trace of its scandalous start. What's peculiar is how something so commonplace today could once elicit gasps, sermons, and sideways glances. But then again, fashion always has its eccentric phase, even when it comes to food's favourite sidekick. Now, with the fork's brush with notoriety behind us, and the candlelight of European feast just beginning to flicker across linen-covered tables, let's drift onward. There's a dinner party waiting, one where etiquette manuals battle chaos and napkins plot their power play. But that's a bite-sized mystery for another moment. As twilight gently folds over the velvet fields of history, we find ourselves tiptoeing into one of the most misunderstood dinner parties in medieval Europe. It wasn't hosted by royalty, nor did it involve poisoned goblets or dramatic betrayals, though it certainly featured controversy. And of course, forks. Not metaphorical forks in the road, mind you. Literal, polished, devilishly pronged forks. Those bizarre little instruments that, at one point, were accused of heresy, flamboyance, and possibly flirting with the apocalypse. Let us now turn our lantern of curiosity toward the court of Byzantine princess Theodora Anna Doukaina, niece of Emperor Alexios III Komnenos. In the year 1004-ish, when the stars blinked over Constantinople and dinner tables sparkled with golden platters of olives, lamb, and grape leaves, Theodora made her journey westward to marry Domenico Selvo, the Doge of Venice. That's Doge, as in Venetian ruler, not the meme. Although imagining her betrothed as a royal Shiba Inu is oddly soothing, isn't it? Now, Theodora, as you might expect, was no slouch in the manners department. She was impeccably educated, robed in silks, and toed to hairline perfumed in rosewater. But what truly shocked her new hosts in Venice wasn't her jewellery, nor the fact she was a Greek princess with a fleet of servants. No, it was the 2 tine forks she dared to use to eat her food. The reaction was less, oh how elegant, and more witchcraft, quite certainly. At this noble banquet, Theodora delicately lifted a fork, gold, naturally, because why not, and proceeded to spear a fig or perhaps a cube of roast meat, lifting it to her lips as serenely as a swan gliding across the Bosphorus. She didn't once touch the food with her fingers. Not once. Gasps abounded. If a medieval soundboard existed, it would have included audible clutching of pearls, priestly murmurs of disapproval, and the clanging of goblets hitting marble in disbelief. Clerics at the court began to worry. Was this an affront to God's design? After all, he had bestowed grubby human hands for eating, 5 holy fingers arranged just so. Surely the use of an artificial device between hand and food was a decadent rebellion against divine cutlery. Theodora, meanwhile, calmly dabbed her lips with a silk napkin and watched several bishops nearly faint. Later, St. Peter Damian labelled the use of forks as sinfully luxurious. He didn't just disapprove, he practically scheduled a meeting with the Vatican about it, though we suspect their calendar was already crammed with plague-related concerns. To be fair, the fork's appearance wasn't entirely new in Italy. Some Byzantines had brought them over earlier, but Theodora's shimmering fork seemed to plunge especially deep into the tender core of religious anxiety. Eating with a fork was seen as effeminate, foreign, and disturbingly hygienic, all things that made European nobles twitch. For a time, especially in Italy, people stubbornly clung to their feel-the-food philosophy. They believed that touching your roast chicken rooted you spiritually and bodily in the act of dining. A physical communion, if you will, between you and your greasy squirrel meat. And yet, dear dreamer, change is an insistent little rascal. Despite their initial horror, Venetians, bless their scandalized hearts, began to quietly adopt the foreign prong. Not with fanfare and brass bands, not just yet, but in the kitchens of the curious and the boudoirs of aristocrats, forks started to multiply like well-bred wolves. Meanwhile, Theodora passed into legend, part fashion icon, part culinary renegade, part diplomatic fork smuggler. And while her golden-tined instrument was once regarded as a sign of wicked excess, its slow assimilation into table manners was really a quiet revolution. One tiny change, two shiny prongs at a time. So tonight, if you reach for a midnight snack with your fingers, know that you're honoring centuries of greasy tradition. But if you reach for a fork, remember Theodora, who soared into Venetian history with a hairpin bun and gold-plated utensil rebellion. Somewhere between these prongs of history and society's shifting palette, a simple question remained. Could civilization ever truly be judged by how it chooses to eat its fruit? Let's just say the story doesn't end with one fork, because soon, well, there would be more. As our evening stroll through the labyrinthine lanes of culinary history continues, we now find ourselves wandering into the shadowy corridors of monastic kitchens, where incense hung in the air, manuscripts fluttered in candlelight, and the clink of metal on ceramic came not from swords but from forks? No, not quite yet. Here, in the medieval monasteries of old Europe, forks were still the culinary wallflowers at the dining party, polite, present, but mostly ignored. These were institutions that prized simplicity and devotion, where meals were often meatless affairs, seasoned more with psalms than parsley. Yet, the monks were the unsung guardians of eating customs, for within their cloisters, dining was more than fuel. It was ritual. Imagine a Benedictine refectory at dusk. Long wooden tables, flickering wall sconces casting amber halos on ancient stones, and choir chants floating softly as a brother reads from the rule of Saint Benedict about the perils of gluttony. One hand works the bread knife, the other clutches a spoon. Occasionally, a knife is used to maneuver a stubborn root vegetable, but a fork, not yet deemed worthy of the cloister's holy meal. This was partly due to practicality. Monasteries favoured modesty even in metallurgy. Forks, being something of a fancier implement, seemed too decadent. After all, when you're sworn to poverty and celibacy, the last thing you need is a two-pronged temptation gleaming at you from the soup tureen. Still, monasteries accidentally became important stepping stones in the fork's journey, because while monks eschewed luxury, they also excelled at preservation of knowledge, seeds, spices, and the occasional exotic utensil brought by weary pilgrims or noble donors hoping to pray their way into heaven with a golden gift wrapped in velvet. Picture, if you will, a particularly worldly abbot inheriting a fork from a visiting Venetian dignitary. It arrives swaddled in silk and scandal, with tines gently curved, like a tiny trident gifted by Neptune himself. The monks gather around, peering at it as though it might whisper heresy. It is a comb for cheese, one brother guesses. A relic of St. Cutlery, offers another. But eventually, someone, possibly a slightly rebellious novice named Brother Hugo, begins to experiment. Quietly, beneath the dinner table, perhaps first with a fig, then a slippery beet. And so, in the dim-lit belly of monastic architecture, the fork starts gaining ground. Not in the open, no, but in the hushed flickerings of curiosity behind parchment scrolls and within the hush-hush loops of gossip exchanged during launderings near the river. Ironically, the monastic kitchens were also laboratories for hospitality. Pilgrims, nobles, bishops. They all came to dine at the monkish table, and as the guests grew fancier, so too did the implements. Now, the fork still wasn't a staple, but it began to show up once in a while, glinting ever so sneakily beside the bread knife, next to dishes served to men who wore rings on their fingers large enough to hold tea. It was here, amid fasting calendars and theological treatises, that forks began losing their shameful luster. In the slow, reverent pace of monastic dining, one had time to reflect, and as cooks in these sacred spaces became more inventive, with stewed pears that melted like prayers, and aromatic vegetables that rolled off spoons like tiny rebellions against austerity, it became clear a fork wasn't indulgent. It was efficient, modest even, the holy middle ground between fingers and a dagger. And so, if you ever find yourself eating a vegetarian casserole while Gregorian chant hums in the background, and you feel the urge to lift your fork with poetic gravity, well, now you know whom to thank. Brother Hugo, probably, or someone just as quietly bold. But of course, monks weren't the only culinary influences of their day. As the fork slowly gained a toehold in the cloisters, something far more raucous was unfolding in the courts and castles beyond those stone walls. The kind of places where people wore hats big enough to collect taxes and hosted banquets large enough to require seating charts written by candlelight. Those very nobles, the trendsetters of taste and table, were preparing to throw a dinner party that no utensil could ignore. And with that invitation still warming beside the hearth of anticipation, let's tiptoe toward the banquet halls of Renaissance royalty, where the fork was about to make its most glamorous entrance yet. Bells chimed softly in the distance, echoing through the misty valleys of 17th century France. A gentle wind stirred curtains embroidered with lilies, and beyond them a peculiar scene unfolded. Lords and ladies, powdered and poised for battle not with swords, but with salad forks. Yes, it was in this age of velvet gloves and exaggerated gestures that the fork truly came into fashion among the French aristocracy. Not because it was practical, mind you, but because it was dramatic. A utensil that let you spear a plum with elegance. Mon Dieu, what enchantment. The fork, once mocked and maligned, was now becoming the preferred tool of the powdered elite, provided it was made of silver and matched one's brocade coat, of course. King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, was, despite his preference for personal glory and wearing more lace than a bridal boutique, a stickler for proper table etiquette. At Versailles, the royal court transformed dinner into a choreographed performance more carefully arranged than a ballet. Each gesture, each bite, each imperious sip of wine was choreographed to an etiquette that newcomers to court had to memorize with the dedication of a Shakespearean understudy. The fork, in this rarefied world, had ascended the ranks from foreign oddity to royal necessity. No longer just a pronged curiosity used by the Italians to eat their tangled pasta nests, it had become a key player in the pageantry of a meal. You didn't simply eat poultry, you daintily dissected it with your silver fork and knife while casting side eyes at the marquis who dared to let his pinky wander too far. It was dinner as theatre, and the fork was now centre stage. Of course, for the common folk, a term that included anyone not wearing powdered wigs taller than their children. Forks were still a bit excessive. They continued to rely on spoons, knives, and a time-honoured technique known as eating with your hands. But the influence of Versailles trickled down slowly, like candle wax on damask drapery. Merchants, politicians, and upwardly mobile milliners began adopting the fork, eager to demonstrate not only their refinement, but also that they lacked entirely the coordination to eat peas with a spoon. Meanwhile, in England, something truly radical was happening. People started using forks not just at court dinners, but at home. Shocking. The fork drifted into Georgian drawing rooms and kitchens like an unexpected literary guest. Think Jane Austen, with slightly sharper teeth. Prior to this, Englishman Thomas Coriate had been mocked brutally for bringing the fork home from Italy a century earlier. He'd praised it in writing, was accused of being a foppish weirdo, and reportedly had people make fun of him as Furcifer, a deeply classy insult that basically meant the fork guy. And yet, here we were. The English had quietly come round to the very thing they once ridiculed. The revolution in France didn't help the fork's image either. As heads rolled from the guillotine, the aristocracy's favourite eating implement became a symbol of opulence. Revolutionary tables saw more wooden spoons and rough bread than polished tines, but the poor fork, like a talent agent after a scandal, lay low, waited out the chaos, and staged a magnificent comeback during the rise of bourgeois dining culture in the 19th century. By now, more types of forks existed than types of cheese in a Parisian cellar. There were oyster forks, pastry forks, fruit forks, sardine forks, a slippery business that, and even pickle forks, the ultimate sign that humanity has perhaps accomplished too much. The fork had become a status symbol, a design challenge, and on occasion a small stabby weapon when dinner-time conversation got too heated. Even etiquette books began to grow alarmingly specific. One Victorian manual detailed the correct process for using a fork to eat lettuce. It involved no tearing and a gentle pressing motion. Gentle pressing motion for leaves. And this, friends, is the same century that invented indoor plumbing and telegraphs. Truly, fate is whimsical. But the biggest shift wouldn't come from a queen or a king or a corseted etiquette crusader. It would come in a place where dreams and wide open spaces mixed with baked beans. A place where Europeans brought their cutlery choices, their table manners, and their charming inability to resist naming every new river after one they'd already crossed. Drift gently now, across the Atlantic. We'll visit the New World next, where forks were met with suspicion and a healthy dose of frontier pragmatism. As the sun set over the velvet hills of medieval Europe, flickering hearths lit up draughty halls, and kitchens came alive with the clank of pots, the spit roasting of unfortunate fowl, and the occasional shout of someone catching their sleeve on fire. In the midst of it all, something curious was beginning to happen. No, not the invention of garlic bread. That would be a blessed accident still centuries away. I'm referring to the quiet, suspicious entrance of the fork into the great culinary puppet show. Up to now, remember, everyone had been rather serious about their fingers. Hands were the original Swiss army knife of dining, and knives, well, they did the heavy lifting. Spoons were popular too, useful for scooping up stews, porridge, and the occasional regret. But forks were strange, foreign, pointy in a way that felt judgmental. And here enters the Byzantine Empire, because of course it does. Byzantium, where silk shimmered, theology simmered, and utensil innovation somehow bloomed. In the 11th century, a Byzantine princess named Theodora Dukaina was married off to the Venetian Doge's son. As was customary for diplomatic marriages at the time, the bride was expected to bring not just political allegiances, but also alarming new ideas, such as bathing regularly and using a fork at dinner. Theodora, arriving in Venice with her gilded baggage and polished sarcasm, brought with her small golden forks used to eat candied fruits. The Venetians, ever prone to dramatics and seafood, were scandalized. One Venetian chronicler wrote rather sternly that she brought with her forks of gold, and out of pride would not touch her meat with her fingers. Surely, they muttered between devotions and dishwashing, this was not just unnatural, it was unholy. And then, you won't be surprised, it got worse. Theodora died young, perhaps from illness, perhaps from enduring too many sermons about improper table manners. Venetian clergy leapt at the opportunity to frame her death as divine judgment. God, they proposed, had seen her use a fork instead of her God-given fingers, and had responded with swift celestial cutlery revenge, which is a strong take, and perhaps not all that theological. Still, the idea stuck like porridge to a pewter spoon. Forks were seen by many in the West as decadent, effeminate, even sinful. Better to plunge one's entire hand into a roasted pheasant than risk being seen with that pronged little devil. For centuries then, the fork remained an outsider in Europe's dining rooms. It tiptoed around the periphery of polite society, occasionally used for sticky sweets by nobles who secretly admired its pokey precision but feared papal pushback or public mockery. The fork was simultaneously too fancy and too foreign, a conundrum wrapped in a question mark, skewered on two tines. But, as with many innovations ridiculed at first, see, opera glasses, powdered wigs, and eventually karaoke, the fork began to gather quiet fans. In Italy especially, where pasta was slowly spinning its starchy web across the peninsula, there were practical reasons to reconsider the suspicious implement. Try twirling a generous portion of fettuccine around your fist with nothing but thumbs and hope. It becomes a bit of a sculpture, really. So some Italians, with sly glances over their shoulders and a great deal of pasta in their laps, began to adopt the fork. Quietly, carefully, between courses. And so, by the late Middle Ages, the fork had begun its slow, tentative rise. Not embraced outright, but tolerated, like a peculiar cousin at dinner who always brings their own chair and a live parrot. People didn't quite understand it, but they couldn't deny it had style. The irony, of course, is that while forks were accused of being decadent, it was precisely their power to keep your hands clean and your table less chaotic that made them perfect for increasingly mannered courts and proper households. In short, the fork stopped being scandalous the moment it became neat. So as evening deepened in those candle-lit feasting halls, and the noble and not so noble bent over steaming plates, something changed. A glint of metal, a hesitant poke, a noodle wound elegantly into a spiral. One diner at a time, the continent began to make room for the unholy prong, and somewhere between Rome and Florence, between skepticism and sauce, the fork began to find its rhythm. Tomorrow night, we'll pause in a place where cutlery met conquest, where forks weren't just peculiar, they were political. Imagine, if you will, a cool breeze sweeping through the twinkling candlelit halls of a Florentine banquet in the late 1400s. Between platters piled high with roast capons and sweetmeats glazed in honey, a curious little utensil begins to make its way into polite society, timidly, cautiously, like a nobleman's secret hobby of beekeeping. Ah yes, the fork. Not yet the silver celebrity strutting across charcuterie boards today, but a modest, two-pronged affair. Awkward, really. Like a small trident attending a formal dinner party. You see, in Renaissance Italy, the fork had both fans and fierce critics. Some believed the instrument to be a symbol of refined civilization, an elegant way to spare your silken doublet from splashes of stew. Others, however, muttered darkly that God had already issued humans a perfectly fine set of utensils, namely, fingers. Yet even among skeptical whispers, forks started to poke their way into the upper crust of European society. And as with most trends in history, pineapples, powdered wigs, and extremely shiny buttons, it all came down to who used it first. Enter the elite Italian courtier, oh so fashion-forward and extravagantly coiffed. The sort of person who could make drizzling fig reduction sound like a bold political act. And when someone like that lifts a fork, light gleaming off its polished tines, well, it's only a matter of time before others follow. But Italy wasn't the only place where the fork flirted with fame. Across the Alps and into France, the cultural currents were shifting, and it turns out nothing propels the popularity of a dining utensil quite like the arrival of Catherine de' Medici. Now Catherine, God bless her politically strategic heart, was a Florentine noblewoman who married into French royalty in the mid-16th century. She is often credited with bringing everything from ballet to broccoli to the French court. A sort of Renaissance lifestyle influencer, if you will. But among her lesser-known culinary contributions, yes, the fork. Legend, technically unverified but emotionally satisfying. Has it that Catherine brought a case full of specialized cutlery with her, including forks tailored for fruit, for delicate pear lifting, and daintier ones for sweets, because apparently bonbons deserved their own weaponry. As you might expect, this delighted the French on some level. They adored a bit of extravagance as much as the next gilded monarch. But the fork was still met with suspicion by many. It was, after all, foreign, odd-looking, and bearing a vague resemblance to the devil's pitchfork, which made some more pious souls a little uneasy. Believe it or not, religious opposition to the fork was a genuine plot twist in its timeline. Some clerics declared using it an affront to divine providence. After all, they argued, God had given man hands for a reason, and poking olives with a miniature trident might be seen as a kind of culinary blasphemy. Of course, gods may give hands, but kings and queens give trends, and slowly the tide turned in favor of tines. By the 17th century, images from European dining scenes began to change. In old engravings, you started to see forks nestled beside knives, sometimes held a bit awkwardly, as if the diner had just been introduced to the thing minutes before the artist started sketching. But the point, pun very much intended, was that forks had arrived. Still, the transition was not uniform. While French and Italian aristocrats embraced the fork like a new dance craze, much of England clung stubbornly to tradition. The British, ever fond of stoic resistance, considered forks fussy and unmanly. One Englishman wrote in 1611 that using a fork was an Italian affectation, clearly implying that real men handled their meat pies with their actual mitts. Thank you very much. This same attitude may explain why early British cuisine had so much ambition, but so few herbs. Forks, however, outlasted their critics. Ingenious little things, too useful not to endure. And so, as the centuries roll by, they slowly made their way across tables, cultures, and oceans. Imagine the clink of silver on porcelain, a quiet revolution marking the moment our meals grew just a little more civilized, or at least less prone to gravy stains. But our story doesn't end in candlelit banquets or debates about divine cutlery. No, soon we shall follow the fork across stormy seas, where ships groaned with hope and dinner settings, and where the new world awaited, slightly forkless, but not for long. As twilight settles comfortably over a sleepy Europe, let's drift for a spell into the gilded, candlelit world of 17th century France, a place where powdered wigs hovered like marshmallow clouds over endlessly ornate banquets, and where the dinner fork was finally coming into its own, though not without a bit of resistance, scandal, and one monk's unfortunate encounter with a roast goose. By this point, our dear fork, with its elegant little tines and image of haughty impracticality, had made a few high society circuits. Italy had flirted with it, Byzantium had bragged about it, and now France was batting its lashes cautiously in its direction. Enter Cardinal Richelieu, a man as sharp as his political maneuverings and, crucially for our tale, a dinner guest of legendary patience. The French table, you see, had long been a battleground of etiquette versus enthusiasm. Noblemen attacked capons and venison hunks like dueling musketeers. Fists tore bread, knives carved with abandon, and occasional groans of satisfaction broke the quiet dignity of spiced stews. But Cardinal Richelieu, ever the neat-nick, was deeply tired of watching bearded noblemen chase slippery morsels across porcelain plates with the faces of Roman gods. The story goes, gently embroidered by history's tailors, that Richelieu had a particular loathing for one of his dinner guests, a portly monk whose beard was of such biblical proportions that it routinely dipped into the wine, the stew, and, on one horrifying evening, the custard. In response to this follicular offence, Richelieu supposedly ordered the kitchen to take a small, two-pronged instrument and place it discreetly next to the monk's plate to assist him in eating, less like a Labrador. Whether entirely apocryphal or miraculously true, this anecdote gathered enough steam that the table fork began to earn proper, if somewhat cautious, consideration in French courts. At first, it was treated more like a novelty or a young cousin visiting from abroad, allowed at the grown-up table, but only if it behaved. Now, French nobility, brilliantly gifted in the art of pretending they invented everything, soon claimed the fork as their new favourite heirloom. Though Italians had toted their forks for generations, especially pasta-prone Venetians, France wasn't going to let something delicious like a food-facilitating utensil go un-Frenchified, and thus began a golden age of grace, where forks became status symbols, crafted in silver, nestled in embroidered cases, and monogrammed with enough flourish to make even the simplest apple slice feel like it had been knighted. There were forks for meat, forks for fish, forks for confections, and, for those particularly suffering from aristocratic affliction, forks specifically for asparagus. Yes, asparagus. Because why settle for fingers when you can wield delicate tines like a culinary rapier? Not everyone was impressed, of course. Some traditionalists clung to their knives and crusts of bread like shipwreck survivors. One duchess described forks as cold instruments of gluttony, as if the tool itself held intentions. And the clergy occasionally worried that the fork, with its suspicious resemblance to a pitchfork, might bear diabolical implications. After all, if Satan dined, would he not also use a four-pronged silver utensil? But the French, never ones to let practicality outshine flair, leaned in. By the late 1600s, having a neatly arrayed fork at a grand meal was not only fashionable, it was essential to the social ballet. Etiquette manuals blossomed, detailing how to angle one's fork to remain attractive while spearing a poached pear. One must never lift the fork too high, lest one's wrist look thirsty, and one must never lick the tines, lest one be mistaken for a farmhand, or worse, English. But what a transformation, from scorned outsider to polished guest of honour. The fork had survived the sneers of monks, the shrugs of Italians, and now danced proudly amidst chandeliers and court gossip. In the flicker of candlelight and the low murmur of powdered aristocrats, it had found its home among foie gras and fanfare. And yet, the story of the fork, as with all tales of unlikely heroes, is far from over. For across the channel, a different world was stirring. One of sceptical gentry, stubborn traditions, and a kingdom that viewed anything French with a dose of vinegar. Next, we float gently to England, where the fork would face perhaps its stiffest challenge yet. British restraint. When you picture a medieval banquet, you might imagine shining goblets, roasted boar with a single apple in its mouth, because of course it had to accessorize, and tapestries that probably cost more than the entire GDP of a modern small town. But now, dear dream-bound listener, imagine being invited to such a feast as a fork. Yes, a fork. In the Middle Ages, that would be less of an honor and more of a social catastrophe. Because if you, sleek, elegant, 2 or 3-tined piece of tableware, had dared to make an appearance at a European noble's dinner table around, say, the year 1100, you'd have been met with gasps, scandal, and perhaps even a quiet exorcism. You see, back then, eating with your hands wasn't rude. It was just expected. You'd use a spoon for soup, sure, and maybe a knife for carving off bits of meat, but mostly it was 10 fingers and 0 forks. Even the idea of using a little metal instrument to spear your food was considered, frankly, weird. But why so much resistance? Why the anti-fork agenda? Well, for starters, the fork had the misfortune of becoming popular in Byzantium. Yes, the glittering, decadent empire where everyone wore robes and spoke in theological run-ons. There, wealthy diners had begun using delicate gold or silver forks with 2 long tines to handle sticky desserts, twirl noodles, and basically live their most civilized lives. When Byzantine princes married into European nobility, they inevitably brought their cutlery customs with them. Alongside dowries, political alliances, and a lot of silk. But their new in-laws found the fork not only foreign, but deeply suspicious. After all, wasn't it a bit frivolous to impale a pear with a shiny prong when God had already given you perfectly good fingers? There's an especially poetic reaction recorded when a noblewoman in Venice scandalously used one of these Eastern utensils. Local clergymen declared her table habits excessively refined, which is the medieval equivalent of a raised eyebrow and a very heavy sigh. In some cases, the religious condemnation went further. Forks had prongs, devils had horns. A correlation was drawn, however flimsy. The fork, to the particularly imaginative, looked like a tool crafted straight from the underworld's silverware drawer. But the fork was patient. It waited. Centuries passed. Soup was slurped, hands were licked, and still the fork watched, quietly. Its big break came much later among the French, naturally. By the 16th century, French nobles started to see the appeal of this oddly practical little tool. You could decline to touch greasy meats, avoid staining your mock Greek toga with stewed cherries, and, most importantly, not drip sauce on a nearby duchess. All very useful. Enter Catherine de' Medici, that infamous Italian noblewoman turned French queen. She brought with her an entire entourage, including chefs, customs, and very fine forks. Her silverware habits charmed the French court, who were always looking for sophisticated ways to not look like total animals while eating. Still, even in the Enlightenment, when people were dissecting reason and debating the gravitational nature of the cosmos, the fork remained quietly controversial. It was slowly evolving from 2 tines to 3 or even 4, becoming less of a trident and more of a utensil. And yet, there were still dinner parties where lifting a fork to your lips provoked mutters. The tide didn't truly turn until the 18th and 19th centuries. Industrial manufacturing made cutlery widely available. The middle class wanted to emulate the gentry. Eating became an etiquette battleground. Suddenly, holding your fork the right way mattered, a lot more than it probably should have. And so, the fork, once a suspect Eastern import with devilish implications, found its place next to the plate, humble, gleaming, and utterly triumphant. Imagine that, dear listener, a life once scorned, now polished daily, and handed reverently to hungry students, sleepy parents, hurried office workers, and maybe you, gently twirling pasta by candlelight, or plucking a strawberry from a bowl like you're in a romance novel set in a mid-priced cafe, all thanks to a saga of scandal, religion, fashion, and the desire to eat lasagna without using your fingertips. Speaking of curious customs and the tools we've turned into table staples, have you ever wondered why knives, the original eating utensil of humankind, ended up with blunt tips at formal dinners? We'll drift there next, as softly as a napkin folding itself. By now, you may have begun to appreciate that the fork's journey to your plate was far less straightforward than a linear path from pointy stick to refined utensil of civilization. It involved detours, delays, and the occasional meddling monarch with questionable table manners. But if you thought royal elbows on tables were impolite, wait until you meet the monks of the early Middle Ages, who, frankly, had such mixed feelings about forks, you'd think they were tiny devil pitchforks sent to stir up trouble right in your soup. Let's drift now into the quiet, cool heart of a medieval monastery, a realm of whispered chants, candlelight flickering across worn stone walls, and long, echoing tables where bread was broken, wine poured, and forks, well, still mostly absent. Monks, those devoted stewards of contemplation and honey production, lived lives of humility and theological head-scratching, and to many of them, the fork seemed not just unnecessary, but suspiciously extravagant. The very idea of piercing a hunk of blessed bread with a spindly metal weapon smacked of pride, or worse, vanity at the dinner table. After all, if one was to deny the pleasures of fine clothing and secular love poetry, surely piercing roast goose with a bit of shiny iron was on the no list too. There were murmurings that to use a fork was to elevate oneself above simplicity. Some claimed it was a sin of separation, dividing the eater from the food by an unnatural instrument. God gave us fingers, went the general idea, and surely he intended them to double as salad tongs. But monks weren't the only ones casting sideways glances at this culinary newcomer. As forks tiptoed into spheres beyond Byzantium and began whispered appearances in Western Europe, mostly through marriages and trade, they encountered a wall of suspicion as solid as a Norman castle. Take, for instance, the unfortunate case of a Byzantine princess sent off to Venice in the 11th century, fork clutched delicately in hand. Upon arriving, she attempted to dine as she always had, pricking dates and meats with precise two-tined elegance. The locals, however, were scandalized. Not only was she wielding this miniature trident with practiced flair, she was, astonishingly, refusing to eat with her fingers. A fork? In public? It smacked of arrogance, perhaps even heresy. The local clergy branded such habits unchristian. Supposedly, when she fell ill and died some years later, whispers traced her demise all the way back to her unholy utensil. Perhaps overly pointy, cutlery was, in their eyes, a gateway to moral decay. And so, forks, like misunderstood teenagers in a medieval coming-of-age drama, languished in quiet corners for centuries, largely unnoticed by the wider dining public. They appeared here and there, sometimes used to serve rather than eat, and were often reserved for the extremely rich or the endearingly eccentric. In some aristocratic households, one could find forks made of silver, gold, even mother of pearl, nestled delicately among over-decorated goblets and bread that seriously needed less symbolism and more yeast. Of course, such forks were used sparingly, typically amid performances of excessive refinement. Dinners meant to impress ambassadors, frighten suitors, or bore distant cousins into early travel plans. Interestingly, this sniffy fork rejection among religious folks and posh dinner hosts alike had the same root: control. One aimed to shun the fork in order to embrace divine humility. The other only accepted it as a symbol of worldly sophistication. In either case, the poor fork was less a tool than a statement. Preferably one that whispered, "I know how to impale a fig without looking desperate." It would take a shift in culture, a soft but steady pivot from symbolism to practicality, before the fork could fully sneak its way into common life. But that shift was just beginning to crest, like a shy wave reaching the velvet slippers of Renaissance Italy. And in the years ahead, the fork would find unlikely champions, those who dined not just to survive, but to savor, who twirled spaghetti, pierced dumplings, and flirted outrageously across candlelit tables, all while dangling a glimmering fork between thumb and mischief. But hush now, we'll tread into those candlelit banquets soon enough. For now, let the monks chant, let the bread crust crack gently, and let your eyelids get heavy, just like the roast everything they hadn't quite figured out how to eat yet. As the flickering candlelight danced across velvet tablecloths in Renaissance Italy, something glinted among the silver goblets and porcelain dishes. And no, it wasn't yet another golden medallion dropped by an over-indulgent Medici. It was the fork. Yes, the fork had finally arrived, again. Hopefully this time, to stay. Italy, in the 1500s, was less of a country and more of a dazzling Renaissance buffet of city-states, each with their own dialects, disputes, and Da Vinci lookalikes. Amid this operatic chaos, Florence, Venice, and Rome were not only breeding grounds for art and architecture, but also for improved table etiquette. After all, who wants to stain their velvet sleeves with fig compote simply because the food was too slippery? By this point, the fork had made scattered appearances across Europe for several centuries, like a shy party guest who kept showing up early and leaving before dessert. But it was in Renaissance Italy that the culinary stage was finally set for its starring role. Among the chart tastemakers of this era was none other than Catherine de' Medici, Florentine royalty with a sharp tongue, excellent posture, and an even sharper cutlery set. In 1533, she married the French Dauphin, the future Henry II, and packed for Paris with an entourage, an ominous number of cooks, and crucially, her own forks. You see, Catherine was not about to eat boeuf à la mode with her fingers like a peasant, or even like a slightly fancier peasant. No, she brought her Italian flair to the French court, and in doing so, sowed the seeds for a forked future beyond the Alps. Now, let's brush aside the wine goblet for a moment and peek into the French aristocracy's reaction to these strange two-pronged tools. At first, there was confusion. Some thought they were grooming tools. Others assumed they were dental implements, which, given 16th century dentistry, was frankly terrifying. But slowly, like a souffle rising in the oven of cultural change, the French began to see the appeal. Forks kept dainty fingers clean. They provided an elegant barrier between oneself and that suspiciously saucy piece of roast quail. And more importantly, they signalled class. Ah yes, once again, utensils as social climbing instruments. Still, the fork's road to glory wasn't entirely smooth. Though Italian and French courts embraced it, many other parts of Europe remained obstinately unforked. England, for instance, looked at the fork like someone had tried to reinvent the wheel using a kazoo. They'd nod politely and then keep using their trusty knives and those ever-handy 5 digits gifted by nature. Even in Italy, fork use wasn't universal. The average farmer wasn't sitting in the Tuscan countryside twirling gnocchi on a silver tine. No, they were very much still in the finger food phase. The fork remained largely a courtly affair, a symbol of refinement and, at times, flirtation. Picture a candlelit banquet in a Florentine palazzo. A nobleman in doublet and hose reaches across the roast capon, fork in hand, touching not the meat, but gingerly spearing a juicy slice of pear from his neighbour's plate, a scandalous gesture of affection or simply fruity theft. In such settings, even utensils could convey passion. It wasn't love at first sight, it was love at first bite. Meanwhile, back in Venice, which was the reigning capital of exotic imports and questionable morals, forks became not just useful, but fashionable. With their love of luxury and low tolerance for sticky fingers, the Venetians began designing forks with inlaid gems, carved ivory handles, and enough ornamentation to distract from the fact that they were essentially just food pitchforks, but glorious ones. From here, the fork's Renaissance-era glow-up began expanding throughout the courts of Europe, smuggled in with sugar-laden pastries, carried by diplomats, and clinked during diplomatic dinners that decided the fate of nations and wine pairings. The slow conquest of European tables had properly begun, and the fork was no longer a misunderstood outsider. It was becoming, dare we say, the queen of the cutlery drawer, or at least the princess, since the knife still liked to think of itself as monarchy. But the real tipping point was yet to come, and it involved a delightful quirk of the human imagination, one that would shape not just dining habits, but how entire nations would set their tables for centuries. For now, as the fire crackles low and velvet curtains whisper in the breeze of another century closing, we'll set down our fork gently and rise to follow its story to a place even more unexpected. You'd never guess where it's headed next, unless your spoon's been gossiping. As the misty veil of another medieval morning lifted over the 100 Years' War, and everyone forgot whose sheep belonged to whom, there, in the quiet kitchens and smoky hearth corners of late 14th century Europe, something rather unassuming was slowly taking root. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't even particularly pointy yet. But it would, in time, poke its way into history. The idea that a dinner fork could be more than a novelty for nobles with far too many napkins. By now, the fork had tiptoed into Italy, whispered a few words in Latin, probably something sarcastic, and made itself a quiet guest at noble dinners. But just as the fork was settling in, it encountered the usual European resistance to anything new: religious suspicion, anxiously entangled moustaches, and the general conviction that God probably wouldn't approve of something that looked like a devil's gardening tool. Around 1380, the Venetian elite had begun to use forks regularly. Not surprisingly, this caused a stir. You see, in a time when gnawing, scooping, and politely pretending to care about your table hygiene were perfectly acceptable methods of food consumption, the fork was viewed as excessive, sinful even. A few pious voices, particularly among the clergy, argued that God had already given humanity perfectly good utensils, attached to our arms no less. Why lift food with man-made prongs, they questioned with stern solemnity, when the Lord himself hath fashioned our fingers? It's a compelling theological argument, at least until one remembers how soup behaves. But, oh, for the Venetians, they couldn't help themselves. Suppers had become miniature operas of etiquette, with long-fingered forks gliding over broiled artichokes, as string quartets played softly in anterooms and powdered wigs itched spiritually. There was even a curious belief that using a fork helped preserve one's dainty complexion, keeping sticky meats and rich cheeses from invading one's much-laboured face powder. And so, amid candlelight and an outrageous number of courses, the fork became a kind of silent social cue. If you had one, you were likely important, or you knew someone who complained loudly at banquets. To refuse a fork was to risk being seen as provincial, or worse, French. This was the age when table manners began to congeal, pardon the word, into recognizable form. Recipes were being written down with a seriousness previously reserved for law codes and invocations. And with this new flourish of recorded culinary ritual came the birth of tricky sauces, elegant mashes, and meats too delicate to smack onto your tongue via bare hand. The fork didn't just make sense, it became necessary. Yet not everyone was twirling goose meat around silver tines. In the kitchens of the common folk and among muddy-booted farmers, fingers stayed securely in charge. A fork was still rare enough that if you dropped one on the floor, someone might mistake it for weaponry or a tool for digging tiny, misunderstood graves. And speaking of misunderstood, one of the most amusing bystanders to the fork's rise was King Charles V of France, a man known not for his fork enthusiasm, but for his epic cutlery collection. While the French court sniffed at forks as if they were questionable poetry, Charles quietly amassed an arsenal of tableware, some of which included multi-pronged items so foreign that even his own servants required training. There's a delicious irony in that. A king so powerful he could summon armies, yet apparently tormented by the complexities of which prong to aim at his pheasant first. Among the elite, the fork's protruding presence hinted at a philosophical divide. Some dined with rational precision, and others devoured with medieval abandon. One duchess in Florence famously banished forks from her banquet after catching a guest using it to eat fruit, a behavior considered as uncouth as dancing in church slippers. But slowly, as molasses would one day do on colonial porridge, the fork crept forward, from courts to merchant tables, from nobles whispering about sanitation, to alchemists proposing forks as health tools, because clearly stabbing your food made it less virulent. From suspicion to habit, and from habit to expectation. The fork, like so many inventions before it, did not arrive with fanfare. It infiltrated patiently, it seduced gently, and soon no one could quite remember what they'd done before without it. But there's still a delicious question left unanswered. How exactly did this elegant intruder capture the heart of France herself? The final battlefield, dappled with sauces, starches, and revolutionary fervour. Drift gently, dear listener, and we shall uncork that tale next, just as carefully as one ought to uncork a bottle of 18th century brandy, with grace, ceremony, and maybe a tiny silver fork nearby, just in case. The year was 1633, and the city of Florence was in its usual operatic drama phase. That is to say, elegant palazzos, grand thinkers, and scandal over dinner etiquette. While the world may have been marvelling at astronomers peering into the heavens, the inhabitants of Florence were daintily, and at times indignantly, trying to stab their ravioli with a curious two-tined utensil that promised both elegance and pierced pasta. Enter stage left, the Medici family. No historical tale is complete without them swirling goblets of wine, funding the Renaissance, and, less famously, grappling with the geometry of forks. You see, the Medici court, always suspiciously trend-aware, had taken a shine to this peculiar pointed implement, making its rounds from Byzantium via Venetian shipping routes and traveller gossip. If history had a Pinterest board, the Medici would have been its top curators. But forks, in those days, were still controversial, too exotic, too pointy, too ostentatiously Eastern, and heavily rumoured to be favoured by the devil, who, it was said, also appreciated a well-turned handle and precise prongs. Apparently, sulphuric lakes required delicate utensils too. Nevertheless, among the Florentine elite, the fork was steadily finding defenders, especially among women of the court, who noted, with a kind of dignified relief, that using a fork prevented the unattractive widening of one's mouth when consuming tagliatelle. It was not a matter of vanity, they insisted, but civic grace. And so, tiny revolution by dinner party, the fork edged its way into the manners of the aristocracy. Naturally, however, not everyone was pleased. One famous letter from a Vatican official bemoaned that men now lift food not with the hand given to Adam by God, but by sticks that mimic claws. Apparently, divine design was being upstaged by cutlery. Some of the pushback, it must be said, stemmed from practical failure. Early forks, especially the two-prong models, were about as effective at holding onto a mushroom as a lobster trying to play the violin. Food tumbled, sauces splashed, and diners were occasionally poked in the vicinity of the left eye. There was murmuring at tables, rumours. Forks were too lightweight, some said, too feminine. Even haunted, whispered one servant, after catching a glint in the prongs under candlelight. But despite these supernatural suspicions and mechanical shortcomings, the fork's destiny, it seemed, was forged. The breakthrough came not through religious reformation or philosophical debate, but through metallurgy. Yes, the quiet heroes of our story, the blacksmiths and artisans, began tweaking the fork much as they did armour and fencing blades. Somewhere between smelting and gossiping, someone wisely thought, what if we add 2 more prongs? 4 tines, a subtle innovation that changed dining forever. Suddenly, food was actually staying on the fork. Lettuce could be lifted, meat could be speared, dignity could be maintained. The invention spread faster than an overly enthusiastic innkeeper when royalty were rumoured to be travelling the next morning. Indeed, it was in these continental dining rooms, decorated in velvet drapes, candle shadows trembling on frescoed ceilings, that the fork truly earned its social passport. It no longer whispered of foreign shores or demonic accusations. It declared itself merely useful, perhaps even suave. By the mid-17th century, it began accompanying knives and spoons with an air of inevitability, no longer an imposter, but the third musketeer of mealtime. Still, in many parts of Europe, particularly in the English Isles, the fork remained suspect. Even as Italy and France were lifting fettuccine like orchestral conductors, English gentry were yelling pish and spearing their dinner with knives like medieval trout hunters. But that would change. And soon. As night begins to settle again over Europe's silver-bright banquet halls and flickering candlelight dances across porcelain glaze, let us wander gently northward. There waits a stage of powdered wigs, courtly conservatism, and a reluctant embrace of the pointy end of progress. Somewhere on the banks of the Seine, Around the year 1790, a French nobleman stared down at a fork and wondered if it could be improved. Not for logic or ergonomics, mind you, but for flair. You see, the French aristocracy had a particular fondness for taking practical things and making them shine with impractical glory. This was the age when even chamber pots had gold trim and wigs were large enough to require their own footmen. Why should forks not also join in on the excess? By then, the fork had already established itself in the opulent court of Versailles, with its 4 tines poised like little ballet dancers on point. But in a world teetering on the slippery edge of revolution, even utensils were not safe from judgment. Forks, so long seen as a marker of civility, wealth, and the ability to delicately skewer tiny cubes of roasted pigeon, were suddenly viewed by revolutionaries as miniature pitchforks of privilege. Indeed, while the guillotine claimed heads, it was the fork that quietly lost its silver luster. During the French Revolution, owning too many fancy forks could suggest you were dangerously enthusiastic about the monarchy, or at least too keen on soufflé. The practical solution: wooden utensils, humble, splintered, revolutionary wooden forks. Though perhaps not as elegant for spearing asparagus, they were rather good at sounding egalitarian. Vive la rustic cutlery! But let us drift gently away from the tumbling chaos of bread riots and powdered wigs, and into a more refined corner of the world, Vienna, Austria, another musical, marzipan-scented realm, where forks found new expression not through politics, but pastries. In Vienna's famed coffee houses, where intellectuals brooded and pianos softly wept under the impressive twirl of mustaches, the fork was quietly becoming an essential tool. Not for salads or steak, mind you, but for cake. Sachertorte, to be precise. That dense, chocolate Viennese confection, which required the kind of utensil that could slice with grace and also deliver a precise angle of attack. Thus, pastry forks were born. Dainty, curved things with a broader tine on the left side, perfect for both slicing and lifting. If you've never held a pastry fork, it resembles a tiny trident designed by someone who clearly loved Mozart and marzipan more than warfare. And really, that's what makes it so lovely. In a world swirling with empires and uprisings, someone somewhere said, "You know what this cupcake needs? A better tool." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American forks were experiencing their own identity crisis. In the early 1800s, Americans were still rather bashful about formal dining. The fork had arrived, yes, but was eyed with suspicion in many homes, as it seemed too European, too fussy, too untrustworthy compared to the honest Republican spoon. Some even feared, genuinely, that forks might feminize men or make them too delicate. Heaven forbid a rigorous American farmer become too dainty when attacking his ham steak. But then, everything changed with the arrival of what might be the most passionately debated concept of all, the proper way to use a fork and knife. Welcome to the fork-holding debate. In the British and European method, often referred to as the continental style, the fork remains in the left hand, tines facing down, while the knife stays in the right, working in dazzling concert like synchronized swans. But Americans developed their own method, sometimes called the zigzag or cut and switch. One cuts with fork in left hand, knife in right, then sets the knife down, transfers the fork to the right hand, and proceeds to eat. To outsiders, this may seem unnecessarily fussy. To Americans, it's tradition, like baseball, jazz, or putting ice in everything. This minor difference in fork behavior became a cultural marker so distinctive that dinner guests could be evaluated not just on manners, but on the angle of their asparagus transfer. And so, the fork, by this point, had become more than a tool. It was a social signal, a way to stake your place in the world, even if that world was simply a candlelit supper with Aunt Geraldine and her collection of terrifying salt shakers. Strangely enough, as cutlery continued evolving into the industrial age, with mass-produced utensils flooding into kitchens from Ohio to Osaka, the fork retained its air of solemn dignity. It was no longer just for kings, poets, or revolutionaries. It now communed with humble mashed potatoes and weekday green beans, making small talk with the napkin ring and keeping quiet judgment over the spork rattling nervously in the drawer below. And as we drift toward the next scene, nestled softly in the warm flicker of gas lamps and factory fires, the humble table fork is about to march into the machine age, whether its tines are ready or not. As the evening fog curls like lazy steam above the cobbled streets of 18th century London, our tale drifts quietly, like a nap wrapped in tweed, into the age of ambitious table manners and heavily powdered wigs. Here, amid the gaslit glow of drawing rooms and the scent of roast goose drifting from kitchen hearths, the fork had begun to enjoy its long-awaited promotion from novelty utensil to regular dinner guest. By this time, dinner time was starting to resemble the formal theatre of modern fine dining. Eating without a fork, that was beginning to feel as backward as wearing socks on your hands or asking a duck for fashion advice. Now, London's elite may have owned entire servants just to open letters or whisper poetry at parties, but even they, those lacy-cuffed champions of etiquette, had only recently begun to believe in the fork's true potential. Before then, they were quite satisfied, alternating between spoons for soups, knives for hacking, and fingers for practically everything else. Artfully, of course, with pinkies extended like periscopes peeking above the waves of gravy. It was around this time that the English fork truly began to take shape, both figuratively and literally, into something dazzlingly respectable. No longer content to merely poke roasted partridge or stab at slippery peas, it gained a certain elegance. 4 tines became the norm. A tilt here, a curve there. Perhaps a mother-of-pearl handle if you were feeling bucolically aristocratic. What's curious, delightfully so, is how much the inner lives of people began to mirror their forks. The more civilized the eating utensil became, the more people felt they too should evolve. Dainty gestures replaced Viking-esque shoveling. Conversation over cod replaced grunts during gruel. Even the concept of course dining, where food arrives in polite waves rather than one boisterous culinary monsoon, gained popularity. At grand tables in manor houses and upper-crust townhomes, the fork was expected to do more than just lift a buttered turnip. It was part of a performance, a slow, elegant waltz of meat carvings and vegetable placements, punctuated now and again by a scandalous anecdote about someone being seen using their soup spoon backward. But lest you think the lowly masses missed out on this pronged revolution, consider the humble taverns and alehouses. While noblemen might twirl their cravats before spearing a morsel of pheasant breast, common folk were also beginning to experiment with the fork, especially in dance halls and supper clubs that boasted continental flair. Some enterprising blacksmiths even forged rustic forks specifically for labourers, a sort of proletariat prong. Of course, not everyone took to forks right away. There remained a few stubborn trenchermen, mostly aging baronets, salty sailors, and tireless defenders of traditional English roast dinners, who insisted, through greased whiskers and misused napkins, that their fingers remained the Lord's own utensils. And fingers, they argued, had never failed them. Still, the tide was turning. Literary salons sipped their sherry beside candlelit plates of oysters. Political clubs argued reform between forkfuls of mutton. And even children were trained in fork etiquette, often by tutors who looked like they were trained in sternness by granite itself. Interestingly, the fork's rise also pressured chefs to change their ways. Previously, food was made to be torn, dunked, or scooped. But with forks advancing onto every tabletop like silent little soldiers, recipes needed to behave. Vegetables were cubed, meat sliced thinner, sauces thickened slightly, lest they make an unfortunate run for it. We could say, with just a wink, that forks civilized not just the table, but the tongue and temperament too. They encouraged patience, conversation, and, you guessed it, chewing. A simple invention really, but one that created cascades. So there sat London, foggy and forked, humming along with a stomach full of pudding and progress. The table, once a battlefield of clashing hands and sloppy spoons, had finally become a stage for refined choreography, with prongs held aloft as quiet symbols of elegance. And yet, just over the English Channel, another transformation was poking about, one far more decadent and perhaps just a little flaky. We drift onward, toward the scrolls and sugar sculptures of Versailles, the porcelain clink of silverware on plate, the quiet, regal rhythm of a dinner table, and sitting humbly beside your steak, your asparagus, your slightly overcooked risotto, there it is, the fork, seemingly unassuming, quietly dignified, like a valet in utensil form. But before it found itself nestled next to butter knives and salad spoons in polished cutlery drawers, the fork had to survive a gauntlet of roast eyebrows, papal judgment, and sheer medieval confusion. By the 1600s, the fork had finally tiptoed its way across Western Europe, courtesy of aristocrats with a suspicious fondness for poking things. But as it turns out, not everyone was ready to embrace this dainty, pronged intruder. Let us drift now to England, a land of pies, puddings, and persistent drizzle. Here, a man named Thomas Coriat, equal parts traveller and enthusiastic dinner guest, took it upon himself to bring the fork into the limelight. During a grand tour of Italy in 1608, a sort of early version of a gap year with more uncomfortable shoes, Coriat encountered the Italian penchant for using forks at meals. He was immediately impressed. This was civilized. This was elegant. This let you eat melon without your hands smelling like a fruit bowl for days. Returning to England, proudly wielding his two-pronged souvenir, Coriat expected admiration. What he got was mockery. He was nicknamed Furcifer, derived from furca, the Latin for fork, but conveniently also meaning scoundrel or rascal. In Elizabethan England, it was less "well done, Thomas," and more, "why are you spearing your parsnips like a court jester besotted with Satan?" You see, the fork was still considered suspiciously decadent. Eating with fingers was good, honest English work. Forks were foreign, frivolous, and faintly blasphemous. There was even a whisper of moral decay about them, as if using a fork to eat pears might somehow lead to dancing, poetry, or gasp, existential contemplation. But forks had powerful allies, and their social climbing was not yet done. Across the Channel in France, fashion and food were beginning their long, inseparable waltz. The French court, never one to pass up an opportunity to look slightly superior while chewing, began to adopt the fork as a symbol of aristocratic polish. It helped that Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, was not fond of sticky fingers, And when the monarch sets the table with tines instead of palms, the nobles politely follow suit, even if they occasionally lose a pea or two to gravity. The shift was gradual, like watching a pot of medieval stew cool into Renaissance ragout. Etiquette manuals began to mention forks, first scornfully, then cautiously, then with full diagrams and directions on how to deploy them without poking the host. By the 1700s, forks had become an indicator of social finesse. The more prongs you had, the more refined you appeared, within reason, of course. A fork with 3 or 4 tines suggested you were urbane. Anything with a more looked like agricultural equipment. And yet, as forks became increasingly prettified, crafted in silver, ornamented with rococo swirls, gleaming like sleepy starlight, they never quite lost their aura of quiet rebellion. Every time someone set one beside a plate, they were subtly rejecting earlier centuries of communal bowls and sauce-smeared knuckles. And so, by day, forks were utensils. By twilight, they were dreamy relics of a long-forgotten revolution, hidden in plain sight beneath napkins and linen runners. Tonight, you've traced the fork's journey through centuries of sticky resistance, across feasts and frowns alike. And maybe, just maybe, tomorrow, when you reach across the table for one, you'll smile faintly, knowing that these little tools, so well behaved now, once needed champions and courage just to sit beside the soup spoon. Let's rest now. There's a little more still to discover. Just ahead, as the twilight of our tale settles softly over your thoughts, let us dine one last time at history's candlelit table, where the humble fork, now serene and silver, rests gracefully against ceramic, having endured centuries of misunderstanding, scandal, and spaghetti. It's curious, isn't it? The fork, that elegant utensil with tines like a miniature comb for food, was once denounced by clergymen as an arrogant affront to God's bountiful design, namely, the fingers. To eat with metal when one had been gifted flesh and bone. Preposterous, scandalous, a bit pointy. But that was centuries ago. By the time our pronged friend twirled its way into the 18th and 19th centuries, it had managed to shed much of the moral panic. Blame it on Enlightenment thinkers, or simply a steadily increasing disinterest in staining one's lace cuffs with sauce. Either way, the fork kept pronging forward. By the Victorian era, forks had fully immersed themselves in polite society. One does not argue with a duchess who demands 7 different types of forks for one evening meal. These weren't just eating tools anymore. They were polished status symbols with job titles. The fish fork, utterly scandalized by the salad fork's impertinence, dreamed nightly of asparagus tongs. The dessert fork, always the most playful of the bunch, quietly hoped someone would skip straight to its course. Meanwhile, silverware manufacturers leaned hard into this etiquette explosion. Some dining sets arrived with instruction manuals so complex, they made the Napoleonic Code look like a fast food receipt. If you've ever stared in mild panic across a dinner party table, unsure whether to start from the outside fork or admit defeat and switch to a straw, well, you're in charmingly good historical company. But beneath the dainty chaos of codified courses, another revolution was quietly unfolding. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just coal and gears, it was also cutlery. Mass production brought the fork to the people. What once glittered exclusively on aristocratic dining tables now winked from the plates of merchants, postmen, and poets. By the mid-1800s, factories in places like Sheffield, England, were churning out steel utensils faster than you could say, "Whoops, I dropped a shrimp." A strange kind of culinary democracy was taking shape. Suddenly, Having a fork wasn't about being noble. It was about being modern, efficient, dare we say, stylish. America, of course, had its own silver dreams. Colonial forks were late to the party, often considered unnecessary luxuries by settlers who needed to split firewood more than they needed to spear peas. But by the 20th century, the United States had not only embraced the fork, it had monogrammed it, offered it in deluxe sets for weddings, and occasionally used it as a murder weapon in noir detective stories. And now, here it lies, on your dinner table, utterly unremarkable, underappreciated. No longer a symbol of heresy, nor a cipher of social status. Just a quiet, practical companion, gently clinking against plates, ferryman of morsels, conducting little orchestras of chewing and chatting. Think of the journey, from Byzantine banquet halls to Italian food scandals, from French courtly dinners to diner tables beside the highway. The fork has endured ridicule, reverence, and revolution, all while basically just poking things and getting them to your mouth. Perhaps that's why it makes such a perfect symbol for history itself, often overlooked, occasionally confusing, but always, always bringing something to the table. So as your eyes grow heavy and the cutlery clinks once more in your memory, picture the tiniest fork, somewhere in antiquity, dropped thoughtfully into a bowl of figs. A curious, rebellious little thing, and see how far it's come. Nestled beside you now in bedtime's soft hush is not just a utensil, but a legacy of persistence, awkward dinner parties, and improbable etiquette. Sleep well, dear listener. The fork has done its job, and so have you.